Apna Course. Get smart, get ahead.
Hi, welcome back to the Domain 5 Part 2, which is a very important subject, which is what is called as the network infrastructure security. So we need to discuss number of things in this network infrastructure security, which a systems auditor needs to know. So let us look at what are the items in this. So as usual, we know the legends which have been used. So network infrastructure is typically what is called as communication network controls. Again, if you go to ISO 27001, we can directly correlate this to communication network control. And what are the objectives of this? The network control function should be performed by technically qualified operators. Should be separated, so there is something called segregation of duties. They should be rotated on a regular basis wherever possible. Must restrict also the network control software must restrict operator access from performing certain functions, which we already seen in domain 1 or domain 2, where we talked about segregation of duties, amend or delete operator activity logs. So if people tampers with the log, then you lose traceability, you lose the integrity of the log, etc. So there should be a strict segregation of duties. Then also the network control software should maintain an audit trail of all operator activities, as we already seen. Traceability is very important. What all configurations an end user is changing or the network administrator is doing needs to be tracked for traceability purpose. Audit trail should be periodically reviewed. So again, we discussed about review of audit log by operations management to detect any unauthorized network operations activities. So it is a very critical function. Network operation standards and protocols should be documented and made available to the operators, and it also should be reviewed periodically to ensure compliance to the various internal as well as external requirements. Network access by system engineers should be monitored and reviewed closely to detect unauthorized access to network. Then the next is analysis should be performed to ensure workload balance, fast response time and system efficiency. One of the most important requirement of your network is speed, because if the system is slow, users start complaining. So the network has to be kept spick and span in terms of fast response time and efficiency as well as workload balance. Also, a terminal identification file should be maintained by the communication software to check the authentication of a terminal when it tries to send or receive messages. What is this? It is something like an asset register which we saw earlier. So you have something called a node register. So you have 10.192.1.1 belongs to NMDS. Then 10.1.90 10.1.192.2 belongs to XYZ. Like that, we need to have an terminal identification file. Then we have what data encryption should be used. We will be discussing in encryption in depth in part 3. For the time being, you only need to know that encryption is to be used to protect messages from disclosure during transmission. So now let us look at the various LAN security, that is local area network. Loss of data and program integrity through unauthorized changes is a risk. Lack of current data protection through inability to maintain version control. In the absence of version control, there can be lack of current data protection, there can be data integrity risk as well. Exposure to external activity through limited user verification and potential public network access from dial-in connections. Dial-in connections poses one of the biggest risks. So whenever you're doing a dial-in connection, as I always say, you need to isolate the machine through which the dial-in connection happens. The machine on which the dial-in happens should be separate. Then we have virus and worm infection in LAN security. We will see what it is as we go along. Improper disclosure of data because of general access rather than need to know access provisions. Again, as we have been talking about CIA, information should be accessed on a need to know basis. Many a times when the LAN security is not properly configured, one department can read the data of other department and vice versa, which can lead to what is called as improper disclosure. Many a times we have got in organization what is called as file server. In a file server environment, say HR department or accounts department or operations, all of them share a common file server. So all the document files will be created on that file server. There can be separate directories for HR, there can be separate directories for account, there can be separate directory for operations. Now each of these directory needs to be protected and the user access needs to be defined. Suppose this is not defined, by accident an operations department can look in or sniff in or watch or observe an HR department's data, which could be very disastrous to the organization. So this will lead to something what is called as improper disclosure. Another important aspect is violating software licenses by using unlicensed or excessive number of software copies. So please understand the concept as we have seen in one earlier slides also. We talk about if you are not using a licensed software, it tantamounts to what is called as piracy. Now piracy does not mean, if you look at the definition of piracy, it does not mean installing an unlicensed copy. It also can mean excessive number of software copies. For example, you have taken a paper license of having 5 MS Office or Microsoft Office. But because it is a paper license, you go and install it on the 6th machine. Even installing it on the 6th machine tantamounts to piracy. So this is one of the LAN risks. Then illegal access by impersonating or masquerading as a legitimate LAN user. We will see what is masquerading in few this one. Then internal users sniffing or obtaining seemingly unimportant information from the network that can be used to launch an attack such as network address information. We will see that also as we go along. So what is the duty of an IS auditor? An IS auditor should be able to identify and document LAN topology and network design. It is very important how the networks are. Again, you need to see whether it is a LAN is a physical cable or it is wireless. If it is physical, you need to have what is called as a LAN layout diagram, which is properly numbered, which will show all the access points, etc. Then the IS auditor should also be able to identify the LAN administrator and a LAN owner. As I always said yesterday also, business owner and LAN administrator is different from a LAN owner. Functions performed by LAN administrator and owner. Distinct group of LAN users, as we have seen, like HR can be group of one user, admin can be group of one user, then you can have accounts, you can have planning and finance, etc. Then which are the computer applications used on LAN to look at licensing aspects, what are the applications, what are the application control available, etc. And procedures and standards relating to network design, supporting naming convention and data security. Many a times this LAN topology or network design, we also ask for a network diagram. Very rarely do organizations have a properly documented network diagram. A network diagram is very important from an IS audit perspective as well as for troubleshooting for the organization itself. So we need to look at what are the procedures, what are the standards related to network design, naming conventions and data security, how we are going to secure the data. Now we have got something called virtualization. If you ask me strictly and personally from me, what is it? This is a bit out of the topic here. We had discussed in chapter 3 or chapter 4 about the various hardware requirements. Virtualization is a concept which is more related to hardware and not and less related to network. Suddenly from the blue, this virtualization has come here. It is a misfit in this chapter, but however we need to know virtualization because there is huge impact. There is a huge impact of virtualization in modern days on the entire way the business is being carried out. So an IS auditor needs to have a broad idea of what virtualization and how virtualization work. More it is related to the hardware component which we discussed in domain 3. So now for virtualization, what we need is a strong physical and logical access control, especially over its host and its management console. Sound configuration management practices as hardening for the host. Just like we have got something called hardening of operating system, we have got hardening of RDBMS, we also need to harden the virtualization host. Then there is something called patching, similar to any other OS. There is something called virtualization patching, then antivirus. Then another important aspect is limited services. Just like in operating system, we have got a number of services which can be launched. In virtualization also there are a number of services which also can be limited, so that unnecessary vulnerabilities are not exposed, as well as logging, appropriate permissions and other configuration settings. Appropriate network segregation is very important as far as VMware is concerned, including the avoidance of virtual machines in DMZ. So we will see what DMZ is as we go along, and the placement of management tools on a separate network segment. So the virtualized network should be on a separate network to avoid, and it should not be exposed to the DMZ. Strong change management practices are very important as far as virtualization is concerned. Examples of virtualization is VMware and hypervisor from Microsoft. All of you would have heard. So as I already mentioned, hardening of virtualization similar to OS and RDBS hardening has to be done. Typically you have got something called instances. So now you can have on one VMware, you may have 10 instances of an operating system like Windows or Unix, etc. Now, one of the other challenges as far as virtualization is concerned, you may have in one instance may be of customer A, one instance may be of customer B. So you need to segregate the information and data and the application between customer A and customer B. This is one of the biggest challenges as far as virtualization is concerned. You as an IS auditor needs to understand, because in virtualization there is only one physical box. The hardware is physically is one. On that one physical server, you mount say 10 instances of Windows 2008 server R3 or R2, whatever it is. Then what happens? Once you mount on it, these 10 different instances can have 10 different application of 10 different customers running, which itself can pose a huge risk. So you as an IS auditor need to understand very clearly the structure of how the instances are organized, etc. Now virtualization has got a lot of advantages as well as disadvantages. From your examination perspective, they may ask you a question, maybe what are the advantages of virtualization or disadvantages of virtualization. So one of the advantages is server hardware cost may decrease both for server bills and server maintenance. So one is your server cost per se. So instead of having 3 servers, one say for example one Dell server or a Blade server cost you X, you have got 3 servers required, it becomes 3x. In a virtualization environment, you don't have to have 3 servers. Then similarly, multiple OS can share processing capacity and storage space. That often goes to waste in traditional servers, thereby reducing operating cost. In many instances, we have seen what has happened is people go on buying server after server, but the capacity utilization of the server is not optimum at all. What virtualization tries to achieve is you can do a share processing capacity and storage space which can be used, so there is optimum usage of resources. To summarize, this is nothing but optimum use of resources. Then the physical footprint of servers may decrease within the data center. This also means you can also mean it is as good as your power consumption. your power consumption may not be as, if it is 3x, three servers are replaced by one server, it may not be equal to x, but still virtualization also requires some amount of energy, but still it is cheap, and space requirement, the cooling requirement, the power requirement, etc. comes down drastically. Single host can have multiple versions of the same OS or different OSs to facilitate testing of applications for performance differences. So testing of applications also can be done. You can have a production instance and a test instance, or a production instance as well as a live instance on multiple instances within a virtual machine. So you don't have to even bother to have two separate environments, one for production and testing. I mean to say physical environment. The environment can be a virtual environment. That means one physical box, two instances, one for production, one for live, which can reduce your hardware cost to a great extent and the related cooling, AC, etc. Now, creation of duplicate copies of guest in alternate locations can support business continuity efforts. So, business continuity efforts can be much easier if you use virtualization. Applications support personnel can have multiple versions on the same OS or even different OS on a single host to more easily support users operating in different environments. What this means is very interesting. So, for example, there is a software which somebody wants to test it on Windows 2008, 2012, Windows 8, Windows 7. So I can have 4 instances of Windows as 4 virtual instances of the OS on one VMware on one hypervisor, and then put the application onto all the 4 environments, and then we can check how the performance and the efficiency can happen without much effort. That is what means application support person can have multiple versions of the same OS on a single host to more easily support users operating in different environments. That is what is meant by this statement. A single machine can house a multi-tier network in an educational lab environment without costly reconfigurations of the physical environment. Similarly, what are the other advantages? Smaller organizations that perform tests in the production environment may be better able to set up logically separate, cost-effective development and test environments. Just we saw a couple of minutes back what we discussed. In the same instance, you don't have to spend double the money on test and development environments. Similarly, if set up correctly, a well-built single access control on the host can provide tighter control for the host multiple guests. So you need to have a very good access control built on the virtualization machine also. What are the disadvantages? One of the biggest disadvantages of virtualization is inadequate configuration of the host could lead to vulnerabilities which can not only affect the host but also the guest. So configuration is a key area. If there is any inadequate configuration, you are compromising not only the host but also the related guests. Exploits of vulnerabilities within the host configuration or a DOS attack against the host could affect all the host guests. So we will see what is a DOS attack in few slides from now. If there is a DOS attack on the host and there are 10 guests on that, by just bringing down the host, all the 10 guests are also down. So this is one of the biggest disadvantages, is something like your single point of failure. The next one is a compromise of the management console could get unapproved administrative access to the host guest. So again here also we are talking about a single point of failure. A management console should be tightly controlled. Could grant unapproved administrative access to the host guest. Performance issues of the host own OS could impact each of the host guests. So we also need to know how the VMware or the hypervisor performances are. If there is a slowdown in the performance of the hypervisor or the hyperware or the VMware, then automatically and naturally the guests of the host are also affected. Data could leak between guests if memory is not released and allocated by the host in a controlled manner. So there is a lot of possibility of data leakage if memory is not released. So cache, what we are talking about here is the cache memory. What used to typically happen is, because multiple instances uses the same memory, so there is a process 1 of company A, there is process 2 of company B which is running in memory. There are a lot of in-memory applications now. If memory of application 1 is not released, or simultaneously managing with memory which is using application 2, there is a possibility of data leakages, so that also needs to be addressed in a secure manner. Then we talk about insecure protocols from remote access to the management console. So well-defined protocols only should be allowed to come into the management console, and guests could result in exposure of administrative credentials. So there is a possibility of losing the credentials of the administrator in case insecure protocols for remote accesses are used.
Apna course. Get smart. Get ahead.